on Hamglar of Cairndale by Samuel Cole, scholar and friend of a fallen warrior. There are men whose deaths diminish a household, men whose deaths diminish a company, and men whose deaths diminish a country. Hamglar of Cairndale has been dead only a little while, and already one feels the shape of the lack. It is there in the streets, though the cobbles remain. In council, though the chairs remain, in the temper of men, though they affect not to notice. There are absences which are merely numerical, a subtraction of one life from the sum of lives. This is not such an absence. This is structural. A pillar has been struck out, and those who had leaned upon it without admitting as much now discover the hidden labor it had performed. I knew him first, as many did, only as a formidable presence. A hard, broad-shouldered cavalier with the air of a man cut from old timber. He did not sparkle. He did not charm. He did not prattle. He seemed not charm. He did not prattle. He seemed instead to have been fashioned for weather. There are men who enter a room and fill it with themselves. Glar entered a room and altered its gravity. The vain mistake this for simplicity, because they cannot imagine a silence that is not emptiness. But his was never an empty silence. It was watchfulness, judgment, discipline, and often, I think, mercy. For mercy was in him, though it did not advertise itself. Many recall the mailed figure, the glaive, the stern eye, the dangerous calm. I remember too the chivalry that moved him to intervene when another man would have passed by. I remember the strange decency with which he bore other people's foolishness. I remember that for all his intimidating aspect, he was one of those rare, strong men who did not seek chances to prove strength against the weak. He was protective by instinct. Service sat naturally upon him. Even in fellowship, he did not think merely in terms of appetite or entitlement. He thought of provision, of order, of what needed doing. It is a small thing, perhaps, beside war and destiny. But I think on it now with disproportionate tenderness. The man could cook. And not in the rough, boastful fashion of some campaign brute who burns meat over a fire and calls it art. He possessed a cultivated palate and an accomplished hand. There was in him, hidden behind that brooding martial exterior, a domestic intelligence, a care for nourishment, for the comfort and steadiness of his companions. It revealed something essential. He did not understand fellowship merely as standing beside men in battle, but as sustaining them. That was the secret of him, or part of it. He was a man of violence, yes, but not a violent man in the vulgar sense. He did not love bloodshed for its own sake. He was a man of peace who had made a grim and durable pact with violence. He understood force not as theater, but as responsibility. When he stepped forward, it was because someone had to. When he spoke hard words, it was because softness would have been a lie. In this, he possessed a kind of moral economy that has become very rare. He did not waste action. He did not waste speech. And when he did speak, one was reminded, sometimes abruptly, that beneath the reserve there lived a deep intelligence. Many took him for merely taciturn, and because he did not parade his mind before every fool, they mistook depth for bluntness. But he was thoughtful, deliberate, capable, on occasion, of speaking with a startling eloquence precisely because he had not spent the day cheapening language. His words came dear bought. A man like that does not chatter because he knows speech ought to answer to something. If I sound as though I admired him, it is because I did, more than I allowed myself to say. There are things I withheld from him. I had reasons, and I am no longer certain they were good ones. He was not only Hamglar, a wandering cavalier seeking some measure of peace at the edge of things. He was Hamglar of Cairndale. And that phrase, in the ears of those who know the deeper bloodlines and the broken constitutional fabric of the Crenland, is no idle geographical ornament. His grandmother was Joella Brightmane, That fact was not merely interesting, it was explosive. In him there existed, by blood and by right, not a vague romantic possibility, but a lawful and living answer to the paralysis that has afflicted this land. The old dream of General Crine, long battered by compromise, faction, and constitutional decapitation, was not wholly dead while Glar yet drew breath. It had in him a banner under which it might have been made flesh again. Let us speak plainly. The Cairndale has been leaderless in the worst sense, not merely lacking a ruler, but lacking legitimacy embodied. Offices remain, pretensions remain, schemes, no doubt, remain in abundance. But a people cannot be stitched back together by clever procedure alone. They require a figure in whom law, memory, sacrifice, and confidence converge. Glar might have been that figure. More than might have been. He had title enough to reunite the Cairndale under his banner and restore what had been sundered. Not as some gaudy usurper, not as a braggart adventurer, as the rightful answer to a long interruption. And I knew it. I knew enough, at least, to understand that he stood closer to the hinge of history than he himself fully grasped. Why then did I not tell him? Because I hoped he would discover it as one discovers the true shape of one's own soul. Not by being handed a script, but by becoming the sort of man who can hear it and remain himself. There is knowledge which, given too early, turns character into performance. I feared that if I laid the whole burden before him too soon, I might deform the very thing that made him worthy of it. I hoped destiny, if it was indeed his, might rise to meet him, rather than descend upon him like some gaudy stage costume. I thought there was time. It appears I was a fool, or perhaps only a coward of a more literary sort. For there was another matter in him, darker and more private, which I suspect contributed to my hesitation. Glar was not merely solemn by temperament, he was a survivor. There were wounds in him older than Oldford, older than my acquaintance with him, older perhaps than some of his closest companions knew. Cairndale had not left him untouched. The man had already seen things that should not be seen. Not merely battle, which many men survive badly, but horrors of a more invasive and unwholesome kind. He bore in himself the marks of old psychic ruin, mastered but not erased. His famed coldness, which lesser minds mistook for emotional poverty, was often the opposite, a hard-won discipline of containment. It was how he remained upright. Then came the King in Yellow, and other such encounters from beyond the sane margin of the world, and one could see, if one had eyes for such things, that old injuries were being struck anew. He held as long as he could. Of course he held. That was his way. But no man simply shrugs off the touch of the mythic grotesque, not if it has found its hooks in him before. He was re-wounded in realms not visible to the cheerful or the stupid. Even his nightmares had begun to dress themselves in yellow, and still he carried himself with dignity. Still he served. Still he stood in the breach for others. That is part of what makes this so bitter. He was not some untouched golden heir snatched away before his coronation. He was better than that, and sadder. He was a hurt man who continued to choose usefulness. A man whom terror had not made selfish. A man who had every excuse to withdraw from the obligations of others, and yet continued to shoulder them. He rode not toward power, but away from it, and for that very reason, power might have rested cleanly in his hands. I once called him a horseman who rides from his title. I meant that he carried nobility lightly, almost resentfully, as a man might carry a fine cloak in bad weather. He did not strut in it. He did not fish for acknowledgement. He seemed, if anything, to desire some road on which he might be judged only by his usefulness and his companionship. Yet title rode with him all the same. Legitimacy clung to him because he did not abase it by courting it. Such men are intolerable to schemers. So he was murdered. Let us not improve the fact with rhetoric. He was not gloriously felled in fair contest beneath an open sky. He was struck by an assassin, because assassins are sent where direct argument has failed or dares not begin. Nobody sends a knife in secret for a man of no consequence. Treachery is the tribute fear pays to legitimacy. And now? Now the jackals will call this practicality. The faint hearts will call it tragedy and shrug. The ambitious will quietly recalculate. But those of us who understand what has been lost must not insult him with vagueness. A man has died, yes. A good man, a brave man, a thoughtful man, a gentle man in certain hidden chambers of his nature. But more than that, a lawful possibility has been extinguished. A path by which the Cairndale might have remembered itself has been cut away. I grieve him personally. I grieve the silence of him. I grieve the steadiness. I grieve the dry wit that emerged without warning. I grieve the way he could look at a room and seem to understand its true arrangement before anyone had spoken. I grieve the meals he would yet have prepared, the burdens he would yet have assumed without complaint, the strange and stubborn peace he seemed always to be searching for beyond the next ridge. And yes, I grieve too with guilt. Had I said more sooner, had I trusted him with the full, terrible shape of what he was, would it have changed anything? I do not know. This ignorance is not consoling. It merely joins the rest. What was Hamglar of Cairndale? He was a warrior, certainly, a noble, beyond doubt. A man wounded in mind and soul who nevertheless remained honorable, a servant of his fellowship, a keeper of strength. A rarer thing than any of these taken separately. A man in whom peace and force had not annihilated one another. He might have reunited the Cairndale. He might have restored the dream of General Crine. He might have become what the times required. Instead, he has become what the times deserve, a reproach.